If you had the chance to pick up an official print of this poster in 2006 for $1,000, I think you made a good investment. Hello, and welcome to Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we'll be looking at the 6th episode of Frasier, entitled The Crucible. My initial thought was this had something to do with the stage play about witch burnings, but after watching it, I think they're totally unrelated. A note on The Crucible? I saw a production of it at my local community theater a few years ago, and it is quite good, albeit somewhat depressing. It covers a lot of the same themes as the Mads Mikkelsen film The Hunt. The only real criticism I have of the script is it's extremely long. This episode originally aired on October 21st, 1993. Despite being the 6th episode to air, this was the 7th one in production, with production code 107. Next week's episode is the 6th episode produced. This is the first time in the series we've had an episode produced out of the aired order. This is common practice and can happen for any variety of reasons, including the availability of shooting locations, the actor schedules, or staffing issues. In any event, we'll see more out of order production dates before the end of the season. The Crucible attracted a mere 22.4 million viewers, a really sharp drop of 1.5 million viewers from the prior episode. Especially given the modest decline last week, I found this surprising. Seinfeld was off this week, so I've just plugged in next week's data for the chart. The lack of a Seinfeld episode as a lead-in may have had something to do with the ratings decline, but given future episode ratings that lack a lead-in don't have this steep of a drop, I don't think that's the whole story. I don't know how cognizant the average 90s viewer was of the writing teams on each episode, as I don't know how readily available this production information was. But I find it interesting that this is going to be our lowest rated episode for a while, and it's coming from the writing team of Cy Duquesne and Denise Moss, who wrote our 2nd episode and was, by far, the weakest one of the series thus far. The future Disney Channel writers did a better job here than last time, but it's still a weaker episode. This team wrote an additional 3 episodes this season, one of which is the lowest rated of the season by a wide margin. James Burrows returns for direction duty this episode. With the exceptions of episodes 17 and 20, Burrows or Ackerman will direct every episode for the rest of the season. I'm just realizing I haven't really given Burrows his due yet. Much like Ackerman, Burrows is a prolific director. In addition to the episodes of Frasier he directs, his most obvious and important connection to the show is he was one of the 3 creators of Cheers, along with Glenn and Les Charles, and directed nearly all of that show, including the first appearance of Dr. Crane. Burrows had already found a lot of success in the direction world before he hit mega success with Cheers. He directed most of the first 4 seasons of the Danny DeVito classic Taxi, before leaving in the final season to direct Cheers. Following his decade-long stint on Cheers, Burrows would direct a good chunk of the first season of Friends, and the much less successful Carolyn in the City. I also get to plug Stark Raving Madigan. Burrows directed the pilot of the underappreciated Tony Shalhoub and Neil Patrick Harris series. Burrows directed a series of other, less successful shows, including Gary Unmarried, The Class, and the Will Arnett, Margot Martindale series The Millers. The Millers is the only one of the 3 I've seen, and in my opinion, it deserved to be less successful. The first season was fun, but it completely fell apart in the second. In addition to short stints on more shows than I can possibly name in this video, Burrows pulled in 2 more huge hits in his career. The first was Will and Grace, of which he directed every episode, and I distinctly remember seeing ads for at the same time as Frasier. And the second is Mike and Molly, which ran for 6 seasons, the first 2 of which Burrows exclusively directed. I'm much more familiar with Ackerman's output than Burrows, but I'd be hard-pressed to say which has contributed more to the pop culture zeitgeist. Coming into this episode, we have a new intro animation. Kind of. There's nothing other than the cityscape forming this time. No lights, no elevators, nothing. Given that this is episode number 7 in the production instead of 6, I'm still betting on the next episode being lights all over the city to finish the sequence started earlier. This marks the 4th different intro for the series we've seen thus far. Like the prior episode, this one starts out with our guest caller scene, and again, acts to establish the A-plot. Again, it's Frasier-centric, and again, it is a strong member of the anti-B-plot brigade. The guest caller is Robert Klein, playing a guy named Gary. No relation. Who is having money disagreements with his wife. Klein has appeared in a number of TV guest spots over the years, but he's actually more well known as a stand-up comedian. He released 3 comedy albums in the 70s, 2 of which went on to garner Grammy nominations. He also hosted SNL during its 1st and 3rd seasons. Klein has done a number of film roles here and there, mostly comedies, which fits given his profession, and starting around 2010, he's done a number of recurring television guest spots for shows like Law & Order SVU, The Good Wife, Madam Secretary, and the James Burrows-directed Will and Grace revival. Today, Klein is considered a legend in comedy circles, and an important influence for a ton of comedians, including Jay Leno, Billy Crystal, and Bill Maher. To tie this back to Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld himself was once quoted as saying Klein was the Beatles of comedy. Our second guest star this episode also makes a phone call in the opening scene. Playing the role of the painter Martha Paxton is Rachel Rosenthal. Rosenthal is an interesting choice for a guest star. Although she's only performed 7 screen acting jobs in her life, 3 in the 60s, 1 in 1970, and the other 3 in the 90s, I don't think she was a bad choice for this role. Rosenthal, who passed at the age of 88 in 2015, was best known as a performance artist. She led quite an interesting life, and is considered part of the feminist art movement of the 70s. Her artistic endeavors generally had to do with either the environment, spirituality, social justice, or animal rights. Her shows were, by any definition of the words, experimental and highly artistic. As one example, Rosenthal produced a 1984 show called The Others, in which she shared the stage with 42 different animals, ranging from monkeys to snakes to goats. Despite having minimal traditional acting experience, she plays the role of a modernist painter well. I suspect in part because it's not far from her actual personality. We get another look at Roz outside the studio this episode. This time, she's joined Frasier at his apartment for a party. The last time Niles and Roz met, I predicted Niles wouldn't remember her when they met again. Roz starts to introduce herself, before Niles says he remembers her and brushes her off. I'm still going to call this a win, as I don't think Niles really knew who she was. At this point, it's clear Roz and Frasier aren't that close outside of work. As Roz makes it clear this is the first time she's seen Frasier's apartment, and upon meeting Martin, comments on how it's nice to finally meet him for the first time. Martin is, of course, not wearing a tie and acting totally socially unacceptable at the cocktail party. It's a good time to be had by all. If I wasn't sure about Daphne getting wise to Niles' crush during the last episode, I am now. Niles comes on to Daphne at the party about as hard as we're expecting him to, and Daphne actually makes a comment about him sniffing her. He does this despite his perpetually unseen wife lying down in the room next door. Later on in the episode, there's a heavy implication that Niles and Daphne slept together, while looking for Maris's lost earring. It's laughed off as a misunderstanding, but at this point, I'm not willing to say it didn't happen. I don't have enough of a feel for Daphne's character at the moment to be comfortable saying whether she'd sleep with a married man or not, but I am sure Niles is just Niles-ish enough to come up with a justification for cheating with Daphne if he had the opportunity. And Eddie gets a new joke in this episode. At 6 episodes in, this is the first Eddie joke that isn't related to staring. Instead, it involves him eating food off the table. I don't think it lands quite as well as the staring jokes did, but it's really good to see a new joke for Eddie all the same. I don't know if this came from Burrows or the writers, but if it came from the writers, My hat's off to Duquesne and Moss for broadening Eddie's joke reserve. Like the third episode, where the Crane family visited the Timber restaurant, we don't see the coffee shop in this episode, but we do get a new location. Frasier visits a gallery where he purchased his painting. I like that we're getting to see so many new locations this early in the series. In Cheers, if I recall correctly, we didn't even get to see the outside of the bar until the second season. The gallery owner is played by John Rubinstein, who is that guy who was in that thing actor. The man has a credits list a mile long, going all the way back to 1967. And he's still actively working today. That's 56 years of playing guest parts. The other gallery employees are played by Eugenie Bondurant, whose career seems to have fallen into a horror focus in recent years, including Werewolf by Night, which, as a fan of Steve Gerber's Man-Thing, was a good time, and the new film The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. In the past, she's played a truly eclectic range of characters, including a Hunger Games character and a character in Ed Wood. The other gallery employee is played by Gregory Eugene Travis, who only had a handful of credits prior to this, and this is his last one. Since this episode focuses so heavily on art, I want to take a moment to look at two of the paintings hanging in Frasier's apartment. The first one is this red and white vase painting hung by Daphne's room. It is a replica of a 1939 Jack Otterson painting. It doesn't have an official name and is generally just known as Otterson's Vase or Vases painting. Otterson was born in 1905 and passed in 1991. He was actually best known as an art director in Hollywood. He worked as a supervising art director for Universal for 13 years, from 1934 to 1947, and worked on a number of classic films, from Curly Top to The Wolfman. The second piece of art I want to look at is this one, where we can see the letters spelling out something approximating Eschenberg by Frasier's bedroom. This isn't actually a painting, but a reproduction poster of a 1977 ad for one of Robert Rauschenberg's art exhibitions. Official prints of this poster were available in 2006 for $1,000 apiece. It doesn't seem this print is available anymore, but a number of Rauschenberg prints are still available, and they are much higher than the 2006 price. Rauschenberg is a pretty big name in the art world, and considered one of the forefathers of the pop art movement. The man has won numerous awards, including the 1993 National Medal of the Arts. He has fans from all over the world, including Jurassic Park writer Michael Crichton, who sold this piece of Rauschenberg's art in 2010 for $11 million. In 2019, this piece, called Buffalo 2, sold for $88.8 million, becoming Rauschenberg's highest sale to date. There's a lot more that could be said about the man, but this video is already getting really long, so I'll just say, if you had the chance to pick up an official print of this poster in 2006 for $1,000, I think you made a good investment. There are two other small points worth calling out from this episode. The first is Frasier's age is confirmed as 41 in this episode. Assuming this took place around the original air date, this puts Frasier's birth date in 1962, lining up with what we previously thought, and making Frasier 3 years older than Kelsey Grammer. The other thing worth noting in this episode is Martin makes fun of Frasier for wanting to call the fraud department, and he gets laughed at by the police officers he calls. I dislike this immensely, because selling fraudulent paintings is fraud, and the police would take it seriously. My gripes about this nonsensicalness of the writing aside, I wanted to call out the number Martin gave Frasier for the police department. It's 555-3000. Many longtime television fans will recognize the 555 prefix. This is common practice for most television shows and movies, and once you start looking for it, you'll notice it everywhere. All 555 numbers are part of the North American numbering plan. Some of them traditionally provided directory assistance, while others were used purely for fictitious purposes. Starting as early as 1961, at the behest of telephone companies, movies and television shows began using 555 numbers to prevent actual customers from being disturbed. The rules have changed some over the years, and as of a few years ago, many 555 numbers have actually been given out. The only ones still strictly reserved for fictional use are 555-0100 to 555-0199. We get a second new location this episode with the exterior of the gallery. It's a nice shot, and it's the first time we see any of the cast members driving. This scene also gives us a better look into Niles' mind. We've previously seen Frasier do rash actions, and it wouldn't be that surprising to see him smash out a window. Niles, on the other hand, I was expecting a bit more reservation from. Frasier wears 3 ties in this episode, while Niles only wears 2. Niles' second tie, seen on the right, I'm fairly sure is the same tie he wore in episode 4. Take a look and see what you think. We're up to a total of 26 different ties in the show, and enough to fill anyone's closet. Again, I'm tending to like Niles' ties more, and I want to call out his first one in particular, which he wears to the party, as I think it looks somewhat like a modern artist painting, and goes nicely with the themes of the episode. Our coda scene provides a new view of Frasier's apartment, and is the busiest coda scene to date. It certainly couldn't function as a cold open, but I thought it worked well enough as a wrap-up for this episode, and it's our first concrete shot of Frasier's bathroom. Overall, this is not a bad episode, and in a lot of ways is an improvement over Duquesne and Moss's last outing. But it still suffers from a lot of the same issues I had with their previous script. It feels Disney Channel-ish, and is also somewhat nonsensical when it comes to reporting the fraud. That aside, it's got some great character moments for everyone, and a new joke for Eddie. It might not be the best episode of Frasier, but it's still a 6.5 out of 10.